evening. It's Tuesday, September 1st. President Trump in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where police shot a black man in the back and a right-wing vigilante then shot two anti-racist protesters to death and seriously wounded another. Trump to denounce the domestic terrorism of the movement for racial justice.
Reckless, far-left politicians continue to push the destructive message that our nation and our law enforcement are oppressive or racist. They'll throw out any word that comes to them. Actually, we must give far greater support to our law enforcement. These are great people.
Trump is spreading the big lie that Black Lives Matter demonstrators are being flown around the country to protest in order to undermine his re-election campaign. Protests in Los Angeles over the shooting death of a black man last night by sheriff's deputies. Meanwhile, in Sacramento, major police reform bills failed to pass as the legislature wraps up its session for the year. Worried about communal violence in the streets of America, catching the coronavirus? Worried that Donald Trump will win re-election in November? While your attention is elsewhere, the Trump administration seeking to fast-track environmental reviews of dozens of major energy and infrastructure projects during the COVID-19 pandemic, including oil and gas drilling, hazardous fuel pipelines, wind farms, and highway projects in multiple states, and the Trump administration to expand the collection of personal biometric information as part of its immigration enforcement, including iris and facial scans, voice prints, and in some cases, DNA of those who seek to live or work in the country. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. President Donald Trump stood at the epicenter of the latest eruption over racial injustice today, trying to exploit the incident for his own re-election, coming down squarely on the side of law enforcement, blaming domestic terror for violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and making no nod to the underlying cause of anger and protests, the shooting of yet another black man by police. After arriving in the city, a visit made over the objections of state and local leaders, Trump declared the violence anti-American. He did not mention Jacob Blake, who was left paralyzed after being shot in the back 7 times by an officer last week in Kenosha, nor did he condemn the killing of 2 unarmed protesters and the wounding of a third by a right-wing vigilante. Christina Onnestat reports.
President Donald Trump traveled to the epicenter of racial injustice with a law and order message in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Soon after arriving in the small city, despite the objections of state and local leaders to stay away, Trump toured the charred remains of a block besieged by violence and fire, and businesses burned to the ground in the wake of protests against the police shooting of a black man, Jacob Blake, that left him paralyzed. Trump lauded law enforcement and condemned the property destruction caused during protests against the police shooting.
These are not acts of peaceful protest, but really domestic terror. To stop the political violence, we must also confront the radical ideology that includes this violence. Reckless, far-left politicians continue to push the destructive message that our nation and our law enforcement are oppressive or racist. They'll throw out any word that comes to them. Actually, we must give far greater support to our law enforcement.
Trump pledged $1 million to support law enforcement in Kenosha, $4 million to support law enforcement in Wisconsin, and $42 million to help businesses impacted by the protesters. The president condemned property destruction as anti-American, but offered no words for the underlying cause of the anger and uprisings, nor did he mention Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times in the back, point blank, by a white police officer as he tried to enter his vehicle where his children were. Blake is now paralyzed from the waist down and had most of his intestines taken out as a 7 bullet severed his spinal cord and pierced his organs in multiple places. Blake's family say they refused to meet with Trump, who blamed lawyers for the missed meeting. But Blake's family say that's a ruse. During Trump's visit, Blake's family gathered near the scene of the police shooting, where his cousin, Justin Blake, called for peaceful protests and a change in the justice system.
We're asking people not to be violent, not to destroy our community. But in the same breath, we're asking to stand with the Blake family. Come on over here. We're not mad at you. We understand you're angry and upset. And we can see why you would want to burn something down, but we're asking you not to. That fist that you put up in anger, we're asking to raise up high in unity and come on board with the Blakes. We're going to make some big changes that affect all the little Jakes around this nation. Absolutely. So their parents can let their children go outside the door, play in the yard, go down the street, drive the vehicle, and not have to worry about police officers that might do them in or shoot them in the back 7 times.
Civil rights leaders like Jesse Jackson of the Rainbow Coalition also traveled to Kenosha. The Blake family says it wants to keep the focus on justice for Jacob Blake, not the president's campaign blitz. Democrats also criticized President Donald Trump, accusing him of seizing on the moment for his own benefit. Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan has ties to one of 2 protesters who was shot and killed during a night of protests. An alleged 17-year-old armed vigilante and Trump supporter drove from out of state to Kenosha with his gun-toting parent, wielding a semi-automatic rifle, and was later charged in the shooting death of 2 protesters, including 26-year-old Anthony Huber, who in video footage can be seen trying to disarm the shooter with a skateboard when he was shot. Pocan says he has family ties to Huber.
Better for their campaign, not for the people of Kenosha or Wisconsin or across the country, but better for a political campaign to have chaos and disorder and then try to play up on that.
But Trump did not carry a message of unity. He instead used divisive rhetoric and inaccuracies to bolster his political image as the tough-on-crime leader. He inaccurately took credit for sending in the National Guard to Kenosha and quelling riots, when it was Wisconsin's Democratic governor, Tony Evers, who called in the Guard. Trump spent much of his time lauding law enforcement. He didn't mention the police shooting that sparked the civil unrest until reporters asked him about it towards the end of Trump's visit.
Some African-American community leaders, and a lot of others actually, have said it's systemic. Where do you stand on that?
I don't believe that. No, I don't believe that. I think the police do an incredible job. And I think you do have some bad apples. I think you'd agree. Every once in a while you'll see something. And you do have the other situation, too, where they're under this tremendous pressure and they don't handle it well.
Do you believe systemic racism is a problem in this country?
Well, you just keep getting back to the opposite subject. We should talk about the kind of violence that we've seen in Portland and here, and we will put it out very, very quickly if given the chance, and that's what this is all about.
Although the Blake family declined a meeting with the president, their pastor, James Ward, met with Trump. Ward said a prayer for the president.
We simply pray that you would bring our nation back to you, to walk in love, to live in love, restore empathy and compassion, kindness, concern for each other. Lord, I pray for our president, as your word says, that you would strengthen him and continue to give him the wisdom and the heart to lead during this time.
I'm Christina Onnested, reporting for KPFA.
President Trump is recycling a baseless conspiracy theory, a big lie, to claim that recent protests have been orchestrated by powerful people in dark shadows, intent on undermining his re-election prospects. The claims first took root on Facebook and Twitter earlier this year after racial justice protests swelled across the country following the deaths of Black Americans in police custody. Thousands of social media users shared posts suggesting a covert network was coordinating the protests, and rioters were descending on communities across the country. Trump appeared to amplify those unfounded conspiracy theories in an interview with Fox News host Laura Ingraham that aired last night, suggesting that protests in Washington during the Republican National Convention were orchestrated by unspecified forces. Trump said, We had somebody get on a plane from a certain city this weekend, and in the plane it was almost completely loaded with thugs wearing these dark uniforms, black uniforms with gear and this and that, said Trump, adding that the matter is under investigation. When asked by reporters today for additional details on this assertion, Trump said someone else witnessed the activity and he would have to check to see if that person was willing to speak with the news media. Also in that interview, Trump compared cops who shoot people without cause to golfers who choke when faced with a short putt on the green.
They choke. Just like in a golf tournament, they miss a 3-foot...
You're not comparing it to golf because, of course, that's what the media...
I'm saying people choke.
Demonstrators in Kenosha marched through the city streets after President Trump wrapped up his visit to the area. More than 100 people following a man with a megaphone shouting, "Arrest the police," and other chants. The city saw protest and some property violence after the August 23rd police shooting of Jacob Blake. The 29-year-old black man was shot 7 times in the back. His family says he's paralyzed. At one point today, a group of protesters surrounded a man who they said was a member of a white nationalist group. Police officers moved in quickly and pulled the man away from the group. One officer pepper-sprayed a woman. Reporter Mike Moen has more.
The shooting of Blake, a black man who received several gunshot wounds to the back, has sparked debate over civil unrest that has led to destruction and how these protests are escalated by outside agitators opposed to the demonstrations. Rick Banks of Wisconsin's Black Leaders Organizing for Communities says it's clear that Republicans, through their law and order rhetoric, aren't seeking to calm things down.
So they're trying to capture that same momentum and just channel it to get people out to vote so that they can keep their power.
And while Democrats such as presidential nominee Joe Biden have condemned all the violence, including the looting and rioting, Banks takes some issue with that sentiment. He says it's a statement that comes from privilege given the anger that black communities have felt for decades because elected leaders haven't weeded out oppressive policies. However, Banks says it's clear that nothing will change under the Trump administration or with Republicans controlling the Wisconsin legislature. He points to Monday's special session where GOP lawmakers refused to discuss or vote on police accountability measures proposed by Democrats. Meanwhile, he says the demands coming from demonstrators still are being misconstrued.
Definitely, I think the call to defund police or to divest from police and invest into other resources.
He says it's not about creating a lawless society, but rather committing funding to institutions that can help communities overcome obstacles and lessen the need for a strong police presence. As for today's presidential visit, Democratic leaders in Wisconsin worry it will reignite some of the anger seen right after the shooting. The White House insists it will be a unifying visit. Mike Moen, Public News Service.
You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. Ruth Conniff, editor of the nonprofit online news site The Wisconsin Examiner, says Wisconsin is a key swing state in the November presidential election, and Kenosha and its surrounding county is a key swing area in how the state of Wisconsin will go.
It's really a manufacturing city, a city that was represented by Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, now succeeded by Brian Stile. But it's a Democratic city in a Republican congressional district. And it's been, it's interesting. I was talking to Kenosha residents yesterday, and one of them told me it feels as though Kenosha is really right in the middle of the target for the right. The Koch brothers got involved in a school board race there. It is, the industrial Midwest, very strong union town that has shifted from very strong Democratic politics to after the union busting that went on in Wisconsin under Scott Walker, and really a targeted, effort by the right has shifted towards a more Republican politics, not the city, which still has a Democratic mayor and a Democratic state senator, but the larger area of Kenosha County went for Obama and then went for Trump. Went for Trump by just a handful of votes, 200, and I have to check if it's 242 votes, but so it's sort of this, in some ways, exactly the kind of area that people are thinking a lot about in the 2020 presidential election, because it's Midwestern swing district, full of a mix of people who have a very strong labor Democratic Party background and have moved towards Donald Trump and Republican politics in recent years.
So these militia-type forces, these white armed groups that were moving into Kenosha in response to the protests, are these kind of like pre-existing formations in your state, or is this new?
Well, Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who shot and killed 2 people at a Kenosha protest, is from Illinois, and there is a former city councilman who is Second Amendment, defend our streets agitator, basically. And we did a long interview with him, which is fascinating. My colleague Eric Gunn did it, but I don't think anybody thinks of Kenosha as a locus of white supremacist, quasi-military organizing. And a lot of these folks came in from out of town. So there is the Kenosha News, which is a local paper, has a pretty aggressively Republican editorial page, some very good reporting, but criticized Governor Evers for doing too little too late to defend the downtown, which, a lot of windows were broken, there was a lot of graffiti, people boarded things up, as has happened in cities around the country after this horrible police shooting of Jacob Blake. So, the politics, the divisive politics are familiar to anybody who's followed what's been happening in Minneapolis and Portland and other cities around the country. But it's somewhat smaller scale, and it hits people close to home because it is a small town. People know each other.
Ruth Conniff of the Wisconsin Examiner speaking with Brian Edwards-Tiekert on the KPFA Upfront Morning Program. 20 more arrests in Portland last night after protesters marched to the condominium tower where Mayor Ted Wheeler lives. They were demanding his resignation. Police declared another riot after the people broke windows, burglarized a business, and lit a fire in the ground-level store of an occupied apartment building. Firefighters quickly extinguished the blaze. On Sunday, the Oregon Justice Resource Center and other progressive groups called on Mayor Wheeler to resign. Wheeler also serves as police commissioner. Anti-racism protesters have faulted the police for their extensive use of tear gas against protesters and for arresting demonstrators while giving a pass to right-wing supporters of police and President Trump who have attacked demonstrators. Reporter Eric Tegetoff has more.
A fatal shooting in Portland over the weekend has left tensions high across the country. The shooting took place on Saturday after a pro-Trump caravan rolled through the city. The man shot was wearing a shirt and hat for the far-right group Patriot Prayer. Eric Ward is head of the Western States Center, which follows extremist groups in the West and is headquartered in Portland. He says our institutions have been unable to respond adequately to the recent violence at protests.
All of these deaths and injuries are preventable. They are unnecessary. They are symptomatic of the failure of civil society and democratic structures to rise above the bias and confusion of both siderism.
Ward says the Portland Police Department's response to months-long protests since George Floyd's death has exacerbated this situation. Portland police still are investigating Saturday's shooting. Ward recalls the outrage in the wake of the Charlottesville rally, which was organized by far-right groups and where one protester was killed.
In just the last week in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and here in Portland, Oregon, Charlottesville happened again. But the nation seems less outraged, and that, to me, is dangerous.
Ward doesn't believe fewer people care about this violence than they did after Charlottesville. But he says people who find themselves in the political center can't turn their backs on this moment.
It's time for the silent middle in the city to stand up. We can no longer just blame paramilitaries or protesters on the streets.
Ward says city officials need to rein in Portland police and make it clear that Portland won't be used as a battleground for far-right groups. For Public News Service, I'm Eric Tegedoff.
A lawyer for Breonna Taylor's family says a plea deal was offered to an accused drug dealer that would have implicated Taylor in a drug operation weeks after her death. Louisville's top prosecutor Tom Wine acknowledged the existence of the document, but it says it was part of a preliminary plea negotiation. The prosecutor says the plea offer posted on social media by attorney Sam Aguiar was a draft. Taylor was shot to death on March 13th. The offer to Jamarcus Glover from the prosecutor's office appeared to show Taylor listed as a co-defendant in illegal activities leading up to April 22nd, weeks after Taylor's death. Authorities say a community college instructor in California with ties to the far-right extremist Boogaloo movement is in custody on suspicion of sending misogynist and threatening letters to a county health officer involving the coronavirus pandemic. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office says that deputies arrested 55-year-old Alan Villarengo and seized 138 firearms and thousands of rounds of ammunition from his home in Gilroy. Villarengo was charged with felony counts of stalking and threatening a public official. That public official, Dr. Sarah Cody, the health officer for Santa Clara County, has been one of the nation's most visible proponents of social distancing and wearing masks. His attorney defended Villarengo as a respected professor. Protests last night in Los Angeles after sheriff's deputies killed a black man, Dijon Kizzee. Deputies reportedly tried to stop him as he was riding a bike for violation of the vehicle code. He dropped his bike and ran. Deputies chased him. The sheriff's department said during a struggle, Kizzee punched a deputy, dropped a bundle of clothes he'd been carrying, and when they spotted a handgun, deputies shot him. Protesters demonstrated outside the sheriff's department in South L.A. Station last night and sprayed graffiti. Authorities declared an unlawful assembly shortly after midnight. No reported arrests. Protests continued this evening at the South L.A. Sheriff's Station. Pacifica's Dan Fritz files this report from Los Angeles.
The protests began Monday evening. Over Twitter, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles urged activists to come to this unincorporated Westmont area near South Los Angeles and to show support for the family of Dijon Kizzee, calling for all hands on deck after he was shot and killed by sheriff's deputies and, as the activists put it, left face down in the dirt. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles' Melina Abdullah at the site of the shooting Monday evening.
This is about a real person, a real man, a real 33-year-old whose auntie is sitting here right now. So tonight is about Dijon Kizzee.
At around midnight, the protest moved from the neighborhood where the shooting occurred to the nearby South Los Angeles Sheriff's Station. Shortly after midnight, an unlawful assembly was declared as a line of deputies formed around the station as dozens of protesters shared their anger over Kizzee's death. Sheriff's officials maintain Kizzee was stopped while he was riding a bicycle for unspecified code violations. Activists are calling for the arrest and prosecution of the two LA County Sheriff's deputies involved in the fatal shooting. Sheriff's officials allege Kizzee assaulted a deputy and tried to flee before dropping a gun along with a bundle of clothing. Activists say deputies unjustly opened fire, shooting Kizzee in the back, and that he could not have been pointing a gun at them. Videos taken of the incident by witnesses and posted online show that deputies handcuffed Kizzee after he was shot and while he was dying on the ground. Dan Fritz, Pacifica Radio, KPFK, Los Angeles.
A bill that would allow police officers who commit serious misconduct to be permanently stripped of their badges failed in the final hours of the state legislative session last night. The measure would have created a way to decertify police officers. California is one of only 5 states without such a provision. Police unions and organizations representing police chiefs and sheriffs claimed they supported the concept but opposed the actual details in the legislation by State Senator Stephen Bradford. Lawmakers also failed to pass a bill that would have made public disciplinary records against police officers accused of racist or discriminatory actions or those who have a history of wrongful arrests or searches. That bill passed the Assembly, but the state Senate did not vote on it before the deadline. The measure was one of the year's top policing reform bills after the death of George Floyd. The legislature did give final approval to bills that would ban police officers from using chokeholds and carotid holds and require independent investigations when police kill unarmed civilians. Lawmakers also approved a bill that would require youths under 18 to consult with an attorney before they could waive their Miranda rights. Current law has that protection for youths only through the age of 15. Journalists would be cleared to go behind police lines during California protests and demonstrations under other legislation on its way to the governor for his signature. The legislation would also prohibit police officers from intentionally assaulting, interfering with, or obstructing or citing a member of the press. A Sacramento federal judge has upheld California's near-total ban on carrying guns in public. San Francisco Chronicle reports that Judge Kimberly Mueller denied a review of a 2017 appeals court decision upholding the law. A federal appeals court is scheduled next month to review a challenge to another open carry ban in Hawaii. Any ruling would apply to 9 states, including California. Most states permit open carrying of firearms. They include Wisconsin, where 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse has been charged with killing 2 people protesting the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Massachusetts voters today are deciding one of the higher-profile primary battles this year, the contest that pits incumbent Democratic Senator Ed Markey against Congressman Joe Kennedy III. The 39-year-old Kennedy has promised a new generation of leadership. He's hoping to become the next Kennedy to take a seat in the Senate by ousting the 74-year-old Markey. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi backs Kennedy. New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez backs Markey. Lily Bolke reports.
Professor Jesse Rhodes says the polls show incumbent Senator Ed Markey ahead of Congressman Joe Kennedy III in today's Massachusetts Senate Democratic primary.
There was a lot of perception a year ago and even 6 months ago that Kennedy was going to run away with this primary race because of his youth, his progressive views. The fact that he's a Kennedy doesn't hurt. It's really been, I think, quite a surprise and, a testament to Markey's acumen and his connections in the state that he has been able to stage this real comeback.
Rhodes helps run the UMass Amherst poll. He says Markey may have set himself apart by co-sponsoring Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and aligning himself with leading progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Kennedy has House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's endorsement. If Markey wins, it would be the first race in Massachusetts a Kennedy has ever lost. From Pacifica Network and Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
Acting at the request of the Secretary of State, the Texas Attorney General has sued Harris County after it refused to drop plans to send applications for mail-in ballots for the November general election to more than 2 million registered voters. Attorney General Ken Paxton is asking a state district court to bar Harris County Clerk Chris Hollins from providing the applications to every registered voter in the county, alleging Hollins does not have the authority under state law to carry out the plan. The lawsuit marks the latest development in a growing battle over voting by mail in Texas during the coronavirus pandemic. That fight is focused on which voters are eligible to cast an absentee ballot, but it now has expanded to include a disagreement between the state and its most populous county over who can even receive the application to request a mail-in ballot. Roz Brown reports.
In Texas, there are strict rules about voting by mail, but last week, Harris County, the most populous county in Texas, announced it would send every registered voter a mail-in ballot for the general election. That was the same process used in other states for primary elections to acknowledge the risks of COVID-19 at crowded polling places. B. Moorhead with Texas Impact says it's not extraordinary to plan to vote, any more than it's extraordinary to plan a trip to the pharmacy.
This is a thing that's like going to the store or taking your kid to school. It's a thing you can know. You can see it ahead of time and know what it's going to look like.
To get ready for November 3rd, Moorhead encourages residents to check their voter registration now instead of waiting until the last minute. For the March primary election and the July primary runoff, Harris County, which has 2.4 million residents on its voter roll, saw a more than 100% increase in vote-by-mail applications. Earlier this year, Texas Impact teamed up with Austin's University Presbyterian Church to make sure every congregation member 65 and older who wanted a mail-in ballot received one, even delivering the ballots in virus-proof plastic bags. Moorhead says most faith communities have members who are older and therefore more vulnerable to COVID-19.
And the one thing that we can do that is not partisan, it doesn't have anything to do with partisan politics, is to make sure that the vulnerable seniors in our church have a shot at voting by mail.
The U.S. Postal Service recommends that Texans ask for mail-in ballots no later than 15 days out from Election Day to ensure turnaround time. If you choose to go to your polling place, Moorhead says it might feel less scary if you plan to go with a partner, friend, or family member. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
Facebook said today that it removed a small network of accounts and pages linked to Russia's internet research agency, the Troll Factory, that has used social media accounts to sow political discord in the U.S. since the 2016 presidential election. Twitter also suspended 5 related accounts. The people behind the accounts recruited unwitting freelance journalists to post in English and Arabic, mainly targeting left-leaning audiences. Facebook said the network's activity focused on the U.S., the U.K., Algeria, and Egypt, and other English-speaking countries, and countries in the Middle East and North Africa. The company said it started investigating the network based on information from the FBI. The network is apparently part of ongoing Russian efforts to disrupt the U.S. election and sow political discord in an already divided country. To evade detection, the people behind the network recruited Americans to do their bidding, likely unknowingly, both as journalists and as people authorized to purchase political advertisements in the U.S. Reporter Rachel Silverman has more.
The operatives reportedly created fictitious personas on Facebook to direct people to a website called Peace Data. Analysts say in an attempt to divide Democratic voters, the site pushed messages critical of right-wing voices and the center-left to undercut Joe Biden's campaign for the U.S. president. Rachel Silverman, San Francisco.
You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast, airs each night at 6. There's a half-hour edition on the weekends, and it's archived online, kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. A federal appeals court today blocked a New York prosecutor from obtaining Donald Trump's tax returns, while his lawyers continue to fight a subpoena seeking the records. The 3-judge panel ruled after hearing brief arguments from both sides. Trump's lawyers asked for a temporary stay while they appeal a lower court ruling that granted Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr.'s office access to Trump's tax returns. Lawyers for Vance's office had argued that further delays would only impede their investigation. Trump lawyer Jay Sekulow said they were pleased with the ruling. A hearing on the merits of Trump's latest appeal will be held on September 25th. Trump's lawyers appealed to the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last month after a district court judge rejected their renewed efforts to invalidate a subpoena issued to his accounting firm. Judge John Walker Jr. said at today's hearing that the subpoenas cover 11 entities engaged in business dealings as far away as Europe and Dubai. Trump has blasted the long-running quest for his financial records as a continuation of the most disgusting witch hunt in the history of our country. Predicted the case would again end up before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled last month that the presidency in itself doesn't shield Trump from Vance's investigation, but the High Court returned the case to the U.S. District Judge Victor Marrero's courtroom to allow Trump's lawyers to raise other concerns about the subpoena. Congress is also pursuing Trump's financial records, though the Supreme Court last month kept a hold on the banking and other documents that Congress has been seeking and returned the case to a lower court. Trump is the only modern president who has refused to release his tax returns. Before he was elected, he had promised to release them. According to documents provided to the Associated Press, the Trump administration is seeking to fast-track environmental reviews of dozens of major energy and infrastructure projects during the COVID-19 pandemic, including oil and gas drilling, hazardous fuel pipelines, wind farms, and highway projects in multiple states. The plan to speed up projects approvals comes after President Trump in June ordered the Interior Department and other agencies to scale back environmental reviews under special powers he has during the coronavirus emergency. More than 60 projects targeted for expedited environmental reviews were detailed in an attachment to a July 15th letter from Assistant Interior Secretary Catherine McGregor to White House Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow. The letter, obtained by the Center for Biological Diversity through a Freedom of Information lawsuit, does not specify how the review process would be hastened. It says the specified energy, environmental, and natural resource projects are within the authority of the Secretary of the Interior to perform or advance. Including on Interior's list are oil and gas industry proposals, such as the Converse gas field in Wyoming, the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas terminal in Oregon, and the Mountain Valley natural gas pipeline in Virginia. Other projects targeted for Cook review include highway improvements in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and other states, storm levees and wetland restoration initiatives in Louisiana, the Lake Powell water pipeline in Utah, wind farms in New Mexico and off the Massachusetts coast, mining projects in Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, and Alaska. Environmentalist Brett Hartles said the move to expedite major projects represents a giveaway to industries that curried favor with President Trump. Meanwhile, conservation groups in the West are arguing that the Trump administration's rush to sell off even more oil and gas leases on public lands will deprive communities of significant tax revenue that could be generated by hunting, fishing, or other recreational uses. Roz Brown has that story.
Sportswomen with the National Wildlife Federation say new sales of oil and gas leases on public lands will hurt Western communities. But that didn't stop the Trump administration from resuming the sales this week after a 5-month pause. Today, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management will put 94 parcels totaling 45,000 acres up for sale. Those leases are mostly in New Mexico, around the Permian Basin in the southeast corner of the state, an area already experiencing air quality problems. Marsha Brownlee with Artemis, a sportswomen's initiative, says conservation and recreation should be given equal consideration in such decisions, even in a state such as New Mexico, which is highly dependent on oil and gas revenues.
Which is so vital to New Mexico's economy. But right now, the public is being taken to the cleaners by an approach that prioritizes corporate interest over public interest.
Proponents of the Trump administration's energy dominance policies say development on public lands is necessary for the nation's economic and energy security. In addition to parcels in New Mexico, others will be offered in Texas and Oklahoma. The sales originally were scheduled for May, but postponed because of COVID-19. Brownlee says given that there's already a backlog of leases, new sales are reckless and should be halted until the industry's 100-year-old laws can be revised to bring the leasing system into the 21st century. Brownlee hunts and fishes in Montana and says during the current pandemic, people are seeking respite in the same natural spaces the government wants to drill.
when we're out on those landscapes as hunters and anglers, we're getting so much benefit from that land, the mental, physical, and emotional health benefits, not to mention the food source to feed our families and our friends while we're out there.
According to the Artemis Initiative, women make up more than 25% of anglers and roughly 20% of hunters and are the fastest growing sector of the sporting industry. In recent years, New Mexico's outdoor recreation economy has grown faster than the overall state economy. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
The Trump administration has weakened an Obama-era rule aimed at reducing coal plant pollution that contaminates streams, lakes, and underground aquifers. The changes, finalized yesterday, will allow utilities to use cheaper wastewater cleanup technologies and take longer to comply with pollution reduction guidelines adopted in 2015. It's the latest in a string of regulatory rollbacks for the coal power industry under Trump. The Environmental Protection Agency says it'll save companies $140 million annually. Environmentalists say the move will harm public health, result in hundreds of thousands of pounds of pollutants annually contaminating water bodies. In an interview with Fox, President Trump has again distanced himself from the nation's top infectious disease specialist, Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying he inherited him.
I get along with him, but every once in a while he'll come up with one that I say, where did that come from? I inherited him. He was here. He was a part of this huge piece of machinery. I didn't put anybody in charge. He was here.
Over the weekend, Twitter took down a tweet that claimed the number of dead from COVID-19 is vastly overestimated. Trump had retweeted the false message from a QAnon supporter, which said most people in the count died from other conditions like heart disease, high blood pressure, or obesity. Fauci pushed back against that claim this morning on ABC.
That does not mean that someone who has hypertension or diabetes who dies of COVID didn't die of COVID-19. They did. So the numbers that you've been hearing, the 180,000 plus deaths, are real deaths from COVID-19. Let not be any confusion about that. It's not 9,000 deaths from COVID-19. It's 180 plus thousand deaths.
The latest statistics from Johns Hopkins University report it's more than 183,000 dead in the U.S. from COVID-19, 851,000 dead worldwide. The University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics has boosted its projections for the number of U.S. deaths from COVID-19 by December 1st to nearly 318,000. That's 8,000 more than it previously predicted. The Institute projects deaths will rise to 2,000 a day by then. The Institute points to a rising rate of transmission, in particular in a cluster of states in the upper Mississippi Basin, including Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And the Institute says national mask use has declined to less than 50%. A new member of the White House coronavirus task force has claims that he's pushing herd immunity as a response to the pandemic are an overt lie. Dr. Scott Atlas says in an interview on Sirius XM's The Michael Smerconish program that he has never advocated a herd immunity strategy to President Trump or anyone in the Trump administration or on the task force. The Washington Post reported yesterday that Atlas, who recently was added to the task force, has been urging Trump's top medical advisors to adopt herd immunity as a strategy for fighting the virus. Herd immunity would involve allowing most Americans to become infected with a virus that causes COVID-19 so people can build up their immunity to it. New York City is delaying the start of its school year until September 16th to give teachers more time to prepare for the return of students amid the coronavirus pandemic. Mayor Bill de Blasio announced the deal struck with unions representing teachers, staff, and administrators. Instruction was supposed to begin on September 10th. All students will spend the first few days learning from home online before in-person instruction begins for some students on September 21st. The city's plan is to restart schools It includes mask wearing, staggered schedules to reduce the number of students in rooms, supplying every school building with a nurse, and asking all staffers to get tested shortly before school starts. A medical monitoring program will include random virus testing for a sampling of students and staff each month. The city used ventilation experts to check airflow in classrooms, and officials say they'll work to make parks and streets available as teaching space if needed. United Federation of Teachers Union President Michael Mulgrew says the union's independent medical experts signed off on the reopening plan. Delegates of the UFT were poised to vote on whether to authorize a strike. More from William Denislow in New York.
Class teaching has been delayed by 10 days and will now begin on September 21st. The United Federation of Teachers has previously threatened to strike unless all schools had sufficient personal protective equipment, adequate ventilation and enough cleaning supplies. Many of the city's more than 1 million students are set to engage in both remote and in-class learning when schools return. William Danslow, New York.
Schools in England and Wales finally reopened today to all students for a new term after the COVID-19 pandemic forced their closure, leading to canceled exams and throwing student grades into chaos. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had promised to get schools back up and running before the summer break, but was forced to shelve those plans, contributing to criticism over how his government has handled education during the crisis. The Department for Education said that a system of controls would be in place to keep pupils and teachers safe, with social distancing maintained whenever possible. Parents who refused to send their children to schools would face possible fines. Benji Heyer reports from London.
The government insists schools are safe and says it's more of a risk for pupils not to attend. A decision on whether to delay next year's exams in England will also be made very soon. The opposition Labour Party has called for the exams, usually taken in May and June, to be pushed to mid-summer 2021 to help cope with the impact of coronavirus. Benji Heyer, London.
The Trump administration says it will not work with an international cooperative effort to develop and distribute a COVID-19 vaccine because it does not want to be constrained by multilateral groups like the World Health Organization. The decision to go it alone, first reported by the Washington Post, follows the White House's decision in early July to pull the U.S. out of the WHO. Trump claims the WHO needs reform and is heavily influenced by China. The British-based pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca has begun Stage 3 vaccine trials in the United States. The National Institutes of Health says the trial will enroll about 30,000 adult volunteers at 80 sites in the country. Mike Clifford has details.
Phase 3 clinical trials for the much-anticipated Oxford COVID-19 vaccine set to begin in the U.S. today, with participants in Madison, Wisconsin, rolling up their sleeves for the injections. The University of Wisconsin is one of dozens of test sites in the U.S. for the vaccine candidate made by AstraZeneca in partnership with the UK's University of Oxford. The trial will mark the start of the third Phase 3 trial in the U.S. for a COVID-19 vaccine, following Moderna and Pfizer.
And that's Mike Clifford reporting. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings, we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The Trump administration announced plans today to expand the collection of personal biometric information as part of its immigration enforcement. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services would collect the data, including iris and facial scans, voice prints, and in some cases, DNA for those who seek to live or work in the country. That's according to a statement from the Department of Homeland Security. DHS did not release the proposed regulations or provide details. BuzzFeed News, which obtained a draft of the policy, reported today that it included a provision that would require personal data from anyone applying for some type of immigration benefit, including those already in the country, and U.S. citizens sponsoring family members. It typically takes several months for a new regulation to take effect after a comment period. This measure is likely to prompt legal challenges, and as have most immigration measures introduced under President Trump. Sarah Pierce, an analyst with the Migration Policy Institute, said the proposal is a remarkable expansion of surveillance, especially the idea that immigrants could be called in at any point to give these biometrics. According to the Washington Post, about half of the 260 family members still housed at 3 immigration detention facilities in Pennsylvania and Texas are children. Now there's a new push from religious organizations to get the children released and to reunite their families. Laura Rosbrow-Tellem reports.
About 450 faith leaders in Pennsylvania and across the U.S. are urging President Donald Trump to stop detaining immigrant children at the border. They signed an open letter this week calling on the administration to release all migrant children still detained and to reunite families. Sean Whiting from Philadelphia, the director of a faith-based nonprofit, signed the letter. He says he's voted both Republican and Democrat in past years, but doesn't feel he can support Trump.
As a person of faith, I have to speak up, and I do consider it the number one reason. This administration needs to be removed in November. Children in cages is not an exaggeration.
While the family separation policy ended in 2018, some families haven't been reunited, and migrant families, including children, continue to be detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. According to Pew Research, Trump's approval ratings from evangelical Christians have slipped a bit, although Gallup polls show white Americans who identify themselves as religious still mostly support the president. Reverend Brian Eller is the founder and executive director of the group New Moral Majority, which organized the open letter. Eller says he didn't hear from anyone affected by family separation at the Republican National Convention, which ended yesterday.
Unfortunately, the RNC has decided just to maintain its platform that it had in 2016. And we think that that doesn't reflect the values of the majority of Americans, certainly doesn't reflect our values as people of faith.
Eller emphasizes there are still children separated from their parents at the U.S. southern border. The letter is online at newmoralmajority.org. I'm Laura Rosbrow-Tellem, reporting for Public News Service.
Masses of people gathered at different points across East Los Angeles to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium, the largest anti-war protest in the city at the time. The August 29, 1970 march and rally was violently broke up by the Los Angeles County sheriffs and other law enforcement agencies. 4 people were killed, including journalist Ruben Salazar, considered the voice of the Mexican-American community, which compounded the community's outrage with the city's largely white status quo. From KPFK News in Los Angeles, here's this report.
Hundreds of people took part in the 50th anniversary of perhaps the most pivotal moment in Mexican-American history, the Chicano moratorium that ended in horrific violence that would scar the community for years. Carlos Montes with the Centro CSO helped organize the original protest against the Vietnam War.
50 years ago, we were organized, we were protesting the war in Vietnam, racism, police killings, right? And we had a good mass movement. You know, we took on the struggle for education and the walkouts. We did the massive Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War and also the high casualty of Chicanos in Vietnam, right? And the significance of that day, that today the struggle continues. You know, we have young men that are being sent to fight in foreign wars, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan. We have young men that are being killed here in Boyle Heights. We had 8 killed by LAPD in 2016. Recently, the sheriffs have killed, Anthony Vargas 2 years ago, Paul Ray a year ago, Serrano, last year. So, we see an increase in killings. We see that the U.S. is still threatening countries like Iran and Venezuela to overthrow them. So we think it's very important to continue the struggle for Chicano self-determination here in the United States and the Southwest, but also to continue the struggle against U.S. war, U.S. imperialism that is still trying to dominate the world. And I see a new wave of Chicano activism. I see, hundreds and thousands of young Chicanas, young Chicanos. Today, I feel exhilarated. I feel awesome that a whole new generation is taking on a whole new wave of activism. And it's already started with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the killing of George Floyd.
Young people like Ismael Salazar of Lincoln Heights says he's indebted to the Chicano movement for having laid down a path for newer generations.
Well, I feel like they've done enough already, and I feel like I'm appreciative of that. So that's why I'm here, to pay my respects. These were the grounds where that happened 50 years ago. So to stand here, 50 years later, it's kind of crazy. It gives you like a sense of pride,
When you say they've done a lot already, you mean the elders in the movement?
Chicano elders, yes.
What do you think they've accomplished?
Well, I feel like my educational path was facilitated, I was able to graduate, and go to school and have enough resources. I feel like they had a part of that.
Many of the participants of the weekend's march were elders who remember the moratorium. Mary Cladoris and Yvonne Sandoval were children at the time. They both grew up in nearby Boyle Heights and saw the march pass through the streets.
Back then, yes, it was against, the Vietnam War and whatnot, and they were fighting because schools were substandard and police brutality and whatnot. And now we're here 50 years later, and, several of those problems still exist. The great thing about it is a lot more of the younger generation is having a consciousness of what's going on.
My parents only told me was about how they couldn't eat burritos or speak Spanish at Garfield High School.
Just right here down the street.
Yeah, still on that side of Atlantic. He never raised us to be outspoken or anything like that. But what I came today for was to honor la gente que pelearon, and they fought like perros, man. They fought and they died for it. So to honor that, and then to understand that now these new killings of our young boys and too much violence por nada. And I'm appalled, but I'm here. I'm here to stand for it.
It was August 29th, 1970, and the Mexican-American community in Los Angeles was ill at ease, feeling like strangers in their own home. The ongoing U.S. war in Vietnam held captive people's attention, as well as the national dialogue. But back in the barrios of the Southland, Chicanos were dealing with poverty, high unemployment, lack of educational opportunities, and police terror that criminalized brown-skinned youth particularly hard. And when it came to the Vietnam War, Chicanos suffered about a fifth of early wartime casualties, while only making up about 8% of the general population. Aron Carrillo with the United Brown Coalition called the 50th anniversary a beautiful event.
Not even everybody gets, I would say, the luxury to be taught this in school. I didn't learn about it until my 20s afterwards, so I had to educate myself on it. Luckily, I have family in Boyle Heights who kind of provided that space for me and that opportunity. But once I found out, man, that sent me into a journey of self-identity, just knowing okay, we got this Chicano background, but we're not told that. We're told about, all these other backgrounds. So that sent me into an identity journey. And that's also a spiritual journey. It's a self-love journey. It's a self-healing journey. The importance of today is to find that connection, that feeling of this brown unity. And some of the OGs that, that opened up the doors for us back then are still here. They're still in motion.
The 50th Chicano moratorium commemorated the march's original demands, although coronavirus pandemic safety precautions meant lots of people were relegated to a sizable car caravan. The mood was still celebratory and defiant, just like back in the day. In Los Angeles, I'm Ernesto Arce, Pacifica Radio, KPFK.
Because the smoke from numerous wildfires is affecting the air quality in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is extending its Spare the Air alert for the San Francisco Bay Area through this Thursday, that's September 3rd. Tomorrow in the San Francisco Bay Area, clouds in the morning, sun in the afternoon, highs in the mid-60s around the Bay, sunny all day further inland with highs in the mid-80s. In the central San Joaquin Valley, Valley tomorrow, sunny with highs in the upper 90s. Sunny in Los Angeles with a high of...
This is a community announcement for September 2020. The Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition calls for a Bike to Wherever Day on Thursday, September 24th. When you register, you can get a Love to Ride app, participate virtually in special events, and enter a drawing for prizes. To register, go to bikesonoma.org. That's bikesonoma.org. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848-6767 extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.